Hi, I'm Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist, previously teaching at several universities, and now presenting on Patreon for anyone who wants to learn about Norse language and myth. Today, I just want to cover a really frequently asked question fairly quickly, and that question is, when you talk about Old Norse, what is that vis-a-vis Old Icelandic? Although usually the question is phrased more accusingly, like, when you talk about Old Norse, you're really talking about Old Icelandic, so you're a liar and you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to review really quickly, hopefully quickly, why there's some confusion around these terms and what people usually mean by them. Now, the word Norse itself is a weird history in English. It's actually a borrowing from the Dutch term for Norwegian, and into the 19th century, it usually actually means Norwegian, and that can include modern Norwegian. So if you read the Cleasby-Vigfusson Dictionary, Icelandic English Dictionary, it's a dictionary of what we would call Old Norse today, or Old Icelandic. But when it uses the word Norse, it means modern Norwegian. It really seems like the term Old Norse for the medieval language of Scandinavia originates or gets popular in the 1920s with the publication of E.V. Gordon's Introduction to Old Norse, the sort of classic English language textbook of Old Norse, and the one that I learned Old Norse from, and today superseded only for people who are not as familiar with grammar by the New Introduction to Old Norse by Fawkes and Barnes. Now, what's interesting is that Gordon himself kind of uses Old Norse in two senses. He uses it as both a general term for the Viking Age and medieval language of anywhere in Scandinavia, distinguishing between an Old West Norse, which is Old Icelandic, Old Norwegian, Old Faroese, and an Old East Norse, which is Old Swedish, Old Danish, Old Gutnish. But he also uses it in a more specific sense, because if you read through his grammar of Old Norse, it's a grammar of Old Icelandic in roughly the mid-1200s. And typically, even when using Old Norse in the more general sense of, any medieval or Viking Age Scandinavian language, we are going to use as our examples forms of Old Icelandic from the 1200s. And anytime you pick up a book that purports to teach you Old Norse, at least in a good one, or you listen to videos like mine that purport to teach you Old Norse, it's going to be Old Icelandic in the 1200s. Now, if you want to be really specific, you can call that Old Icelandic, although that term also faces the problem that it sort of denies the continuity between that language and the Scandinavian languages on the continent. Because after all, so-called Old West Norse and Old East Norse, or Old West Scandinavian, Old East Scandinavian if you prefer, are not that different. I've actually worked quite a bit with Old East Norse, more than a lot of people who are into Old Norse, which makes the accusation that I don't know what I'm talking about as far as Old Icelandic versus Old Norse a little bit funnier to me. And in fact, for Grimfrost's movie Fated, I did a lot of lines in specifically Old Swedish. As a fun fact, the Old Norse in Frozen that I wrote, both the runes that you see written on the screen and the spoken Old Norse in the coronation scene, are also specifically Old Norwegian and not Old Icelandic. So I'm very aware of these differences, but here's the thing. Here's a little illustration using a language that you're no doubt familiar with because you're listening to me. I speak English. People would disagree with that, but for the sake of argument, I speak English. My grandparents spoke English, and I have distant relatives in Scotland who speak English, but none of us sound exactly the same. You speak English if you're listening to me, but you probably say a lot of words differently than I do, right? You probably don't say W-H-E-N, when, like I do. I have one conservative feature you've probably lost. I say wh, which has become just wh for most people today. And I have an innovation, a sound change that you probably don't have, where the the sound N or M becomes M or N. I actually have a hard time even making the form of that with the lower vowel. So there's little bitty changes that distinguish my English from yours, that distinguish my English from my grandparents, that distinguish my English from a distant Scottish relative's English, or Scots, but not enough that you would say that these are different languages. And that's the same with, say, like Old Swedish, Old Norwegian, Old Danish, Old Icelandic, and, you know, even in the 1100s, 1200s. They're not so different that you really have to learn one whole new language. And it doesn't make sense to learn Old Swedish, Old Danish, Old Norwegian, or whatever, per se, separate from Old Icelandic, because Old Icelandic is so similar, and Old Icelandic is the only one in which there's a lot of interesting literature. If you want to read the sagas, that's Old Icelandic. If you want to read the Eddas, that's Old Icelandic. So naturally we use Old Icelandic as the basis for talking about Old Norse. And when I talk about Old Norse, by default, that's what I mean. But it doesn't mean that that is not fundamentally very similar to the other Old Norses, if you will. Or that there's any reason that, you know, that I'm lying or whatever, right? Old Norse usually means Old Icelandic by default. When I'm more specifically talking about something in Old Danish, Old Swedish, Old Norwegian, I'll say so. And if you dig around on this channel, you'll find a lot of videos where this diversity of languages, dialects, etc. is discussed, sometimes in great detail. So dig around a little bit, and if you're on Patreon, hit me up with more questions like this, and I'll try to answer them in more shortish videos like this. For now, from beautiful Colorado, windy as hell, I'm wishing you all the best.